My favorite words to hear. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. It is 1:04. I just pushed record. I will send out the link in a follow-up email either today or tomorrow. So I'll begin by saying welcome everybody and happy 2026. It is January and we are cruising through this year's Lower Cape Housing Institute curriculum. I saw a really nice mix of familiar names and some new ones in the registration list. So I'm going to start us off with some background on the CDP and the Housing Institute program. And while I'm doing that, if you all would put your name, your town, and your board or committee affiliation in the chat, that would be awesome. My name is Amanda Bebrin, for any of you who don't know me, but I suspect most of you do. And I'm the Director of Housing Advocacy at the Community Development Partnership, or CDP. We are a nonprofit community development corporation, and we support the Lower and Outer Cape region with things like small business technical assistance, property management of affordable units, first-time homebuyer classes, and housing advocacy through collaboration with municipal, business, and community partners. And we do all of that to have a Lower and Outer Cape that is home to a diverse year-round community of people who can afford to live, work, and thrive here. Today's session is Water Resources 201, and it is the fourth workshop in the 2025-2026 Lower Cape Housing Institute curriculum. The LCHI started in 2017, and it's a program that provides education, resources, and support to the municipal officials, of the 8 Lower and Outer Cape towns. Its purpose is to help town board and committee members build capacity and expand their knowledge of all things housing so that towns can make progress towards their stated housing production goals. Planning for, creating, and maintaining housing involves a lot of specialized knowledge, and we're here to help provide that. Our programming, as I said, is designed for board and committee members and staff, for bodies that are involved anyway in housing production, and frankly, anyone who serves in a municipal capacity and is interested in learning more about housing is always welcome to attend. So we provide this education and support through a series of workshops on advanced housing topics like this one. And last year and this year, we've been expanding our lens to include the many things that impact housing and are impacted by housing. We know that housing doesn't exist in a silo, and it's really important for board and committee members to have an understanding of all the different pieces in the puzzle so we can work towards solutions and positive outcomes for many of our goal areas as communities. We also host quarterly peer groups, which are a less formal space for town officials and housing advocates to connect, to share ideas and updates, and build relationships across town lines. Our next one is coming up in March for the spring. My team also offers technical assistance to help with things like data and questions of all sorts. Basically, if you've got an affordable housing or local government question, chances are we can get you an answer. I want to mention that the Housing Institute is generously supported by all 8 town CPCs, and we are really grateful for that support to be able to provide the programming and the resources that we do. We are always looking to boost attendance, so please encourage your fellow board and committee members to attend in the future. All right, so that is the spiel. Thank you to everyone for being here. It is great to have some regulars and a bunch of new faces as well. So let's get into today's session. As I mentioned, we do record these sessions, and I'll provide the link along with the slide decks and contact information for our presenters, any resources that get discussed in a follow-up email. We have some really great speakers here for you today, and I'll facilitate some Q&A at the end if we have time. To that end, if you have questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat. I'm running today's meeting solo, so I'll do my best to compile them as we go. And worst case, you can reach out to our speakers directly for anything that we don't cover today. So today's session is building on last year's discussion about wastewater and housing. And today's focus is more on groundwater and drinking water and water systems. And how all of these topics intersect is very relevant as all of the towns in our region are having conversations about it. As with last year, this is an educational opportunity. I've been calling it sort of water education for people whose backgrounds aren't necessarily in water, but that didn't look really great on the flyer, so we went with Water Resources 201. But we're going to cover the topic at a pretty high level today. So if you have questions that are more specific than our agenda, I encourage you to reach out to our speakers. And if there are related topics that you'd like for us to continue to explore in the Housing Institute in future sessions, please let me know in the evaluation or through the chat. So with all of that, I'm going to turn it over to John Beling, who is the Deputy Commissioner at MassDEP, to give us a proper introduction to the topic at hand. So John, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Amanda, and thanks for having me, and thanks to everyone participating. We really appreciate your efforts. This is obviously a major, objective of this administration is increase housing, particularly affordable housing, and we really appreciate all the efforts that you're all putting into it. And we hope to be able to partner with you and help you in any way we can. I'll just say that up front. We're really trying to work hard with local officials, coming up with ways to increase housing production. We've been doing a lot of things. Administratively, we're making some streamlining changes to try to make it easier to get housing. There's a major bill that has been filed, the MassREDI Act. Most of you are probably familiar with it, and there's a couple of components of that that are very pertinent to this discussion. I wasn't a member, but I did serve as a participant in the Unlocking Housing Production Commission on the regulatory front. So I met with a lot of folks, really from the development side mostly, and some housing advocates, and it was really interesting and eye-opening for me. I really got a lot out of it. There are some barriers that we're working to remove that really were, they were well-intentioned at the time. I think that's what we've learned kind of as a country, certainly as a state. A lot of these things were very well-intentioned and constructed to protect the environment. And for, various reasons, they've led to a decrease in housing production in certain states, especially blue states. And so we're working hard to kind of make sure that we're right-sizing things. We still have to protect the environment. We got to protect public health. But if there's things that are too stringent, that are too bureaucratic, we're trying to kind of strip some of that away. So that part of MassREDI is geared towards helping us make some changes. We need some statutory fixes to be able to make some regulatory changes. And the other piece of it, and if you look at the Unlocking Housing Production report, for water, the main problem seems to be really money. It's not as much permitting, and it costs money to put in water systems, and oftentimes it's prohibitive. So one aspect of MassREDI is putting a lot of money into water infrastructure. So we're really hopeful it gets passed, and we'll be able to start distributing grants, loans, getting the money out there. So if for some reason you want to put in a housing project and you just need to invest a bunch of money to get water to those homes, we should be able to help. That's what we're really that's what one of our objectives is. The only real regulatory piece of this for the state is the Water Management Act, which some of you are probably familiar with. There's only one community down the Cape that has a Water Management Act. I think it's a permit. There's permits and certificates. I get mixed up. But as far as I know, and I did check with our chief, I have not heard of any projects not being inhibited by the Water Management Act. So if that was going on, that's something we would look to fix. But we don't see that as an issue. It's really just getting the resources out there so towns can build out, because if you want dense building, right? That's one of the things that's environmentally it makes sense. It plays into costs. So having everybody on an individual well isn't necessarily the best approach. It's nice if you can put in kind of a smaller water system. We do regulate water systems, but typically it's more about money than anything else. I was a commissioner in Vermont, very challenging environment there because it's all these very small water systems, and that's what they would run into. You can only charge people so much in rates, so it's helpful if we can help subsidize some of this and get it to a point where you can set up a system and have ratepayers maintain it, keep safe drinking water available for all. That's everyone's goal. It's in everyone's best interest. So again, I just want to thank you all for the work that you're doing. You can look me up. I'm available at any time. If you want to send me an email, reach out to me. I'm happy to take calls. I can certainly steer you to the right people if I'm not the right person. I'm more of a generalist, but I have a lot of really good people working for me that are eager to help you achieve your objectives. So thank you. Thanks again for inviting me, Amanda.
Thank you so much, John. And that is a great preview to all of the content that is to come from our upcoming speakers. So thank you so much for being here. I am going to see if I can do a little logistics in real time. All right. So to transition seamlessly, we are going to have Tim Pasakarnis, who is a Water Resources Analyst at the Cape Cod Commission. And he is going to provide us with a rundown of the Cape's groundwater and things that we should know about in terms of how our hydrology works, what some of the numbers are. Um, Tim is the expert here, so I'm going to let him talk about it. Tim, over to you.
All right, thank you for that wonderful introduction, Amanda. And I'm hoping that everyone can see my slides now. My screen is telling me that I'm sharing.
Yeah, looks good.
So again, uh, Tim Pasakarnis, Water Resources Analyst. As the title might imply, I get to work on all of Cape Cod's water resources, and just because of the sort of geologic nature of Cape Cod, they're all interrelated with one another. So all of the different water systems, from the coastal embayments to our freshwater ponds to the water that comes out of your faucet, and hoses and all of those sorts of things, like they're all related to one another. And our activities on the land surface and below the land surface, doing things that we're not necessarily seeing or paying attention to, those all can potentially influence what's going on. So we'll sort of start from there, and then we'll zoom in a little bit to look more closely at particularly the drinking water side of things and its role within that greater water resources landscape. So just to start at the most basic level, hopefully, everybody remembers from, science class and like elementary or middle school learning about the water cycle, right? And all of this water is just constantly moving through, we can pick wherever we want to start here. So it's in the atmosphere. It comes out of the atmosphere as precipitation. It lands on the land surface. It can do a couple different things. It can run over land. So that's, what we would typically call runoff, or maybe you call it stormwater, those sorts of things. On Cape Cod, most of it infiltrates. It's kind of a product of both just the topography. Cape Cod is not very, doesn't have a lot of steep slopes. It also has very sandy soils that can accept a lot of water pretty rapidly, which is great. It makes for a very productive aquifer. So most of the precipitation that falls infiltrates to that groundwater aquifer. And, you'll hear me sort of use water table, aquifer, groundwater, all sort of interchangeably. They all refer to this, this kind of reservoir underground of water that is filling the spaces in between sand grains, in between soil particles. And that is, seems like it's kind of a static thing, but groundwater is always moving in the same way that on the land surface, water always runs downhill. It's kind of doing the same thing under the ground as well. So you can kind of see from this picture, it's constantly running kind of from the land towards the ocean and the saltwater interface. While that's going on, of course, you've got water going back into the atmosphere from evaporation from the ocean, from our streams, from freshwater ponds, as well as all of the work that plants are doing during the growing season to, move water out of the soil system and back into the atmosphere through evapotranspiration. All right, so that was kind of a generic high-level view. Looking, zooming in a little bit more to see kind of what does that behavior look like, to provide a little bit more context to it. Here we're looking again at that land surface. There are a couple of features on here that I want to point out. So this the recharge area, which is kind of the hill slope that's shown here, that's indicating that that's an area where water that is, it's sort of losing, the land surface is in effect losing water to the groundwater, right? So it's infiltrating through the soil, it's going into the aquifer. That's, you know, pretty much most of Cape Cod is recharge areas like that. But there are discharge areas, and that means kind of the opposite, which is that's an area where the aquifer is actually like expressing itself on the surface. And that's generally streams and rivers, which, there aren't tons of on Cape Cod, especially compared to, elsewhere in the state and the country. But there certainly are some, and they're a really important feature that I'll point out again in the next slide or two. Something else that's really important here is another feature. So this water table divide, which is kind of over on the left, and it coincides with what looks like kind of the peak of the land surface. But it's actually, when we're talking about the Cape Cod aquifer lenses, It's actually the top of the water table. And so that is sort of thinking about like the surface of that groundwater that's under the ground, which can be kind of hard to visualize. Um, you know, again, water's always going to flow downhill. So from the top of the water table, it's going to flow to in some direction of lower elevation. And what that flow looks like obviously can take different shapes. You see all these different lines on the diagram, which are paths that groundwater from different areas can take on their way to that discharge area and the types of timeframes that it can take to get there. So it's always moving. It's not moving very quickly. And you can you can have places with groundwater travel times well over 100 years on Cape Cod before, that groundwater sort of shows itself again at the coast or at some other surface water feature. So what does that look like kind of on Cape Cod? So this is if you can imagine a cross section of the Mid Cape kind of around, sort of the Yarmouth Dennis area. Again, you have that land surface and, there's some topography to the land surface, but really we're looking at what does that water table surface look like? And where does water flow from, the peak, the top of that groundwater mound is typically what they call it. What is the direction of flow? Where is it ultimately going to? And those are the sorts of things that, you're generally trying to figure out when you're looking at, groundwater models, thinking about what's happening when you start to examine questions about what happens if we add a wastewater discharge here? What happens if we remove water from here because we've installed a drinking water well? Something else that's important to point out, because it is somewhat unique to Cape Cod, is many of the freshwater ponds are kettle hole ponds. And what that means is they're actually areas where the land surface dips below the surface of the water table. And so these ponds are being fed on one side by groundwater, but they're also discharging on the other side by groundwater. And so while they look, again, sort of like a static body of water, there's always water sort of going into and flowing out of these ponds. And so that's important to consider when we think about, what's the impacts of activities that might be around ponds or wetlands or other important surface water resources. Because we're doing today's talk to the Lower Cape Housing Institute, I did want to go do a little digging beyond that because, like many things, the aquifer structure is a little bit different on the Outer Cape than it is in kind of the Mid and Upper Cape. So if you see this sort of shrunken version of the figure I just showed, you sort of have your land surface, you have this large freshwater lens is what we call kind of individual pockets of groundwater. And that extends all the way down to the bedrock that underlies, the landform hundreds of feet down. On the Outer Cape, particularly out by sort of the Hammett and Pilgrim lenses and kind of Wellfleet, Truro, and Provincetown, for a couple of reasons. Everyone knows the landform is a lot narrower there than it is on kind of the Upper and Mid Cape, which just means that there's less land for precipitation to fall on. The depth to bedrock is also substantially greater out as you get towards the Lower and Outer Cape than it is in the Upper and Mid Cape. So what's actually going on with the aquifer there is you have this freshwater lens, and it's actually floating on top of, salty ocean water, kind of within that soil structure that's underneath the land. And so it's just something to think about when we're thinking about how we manage water withdrawals, is that it is slightly different and it requires a little bit of extra consideration. Okay, so what I want to get into, because it's often a point of confusion, is the Cape Cod aquifer system. And I'll be very, very specific about that because A lot of the time we hear about the Cape Cod aquifer as if it's a single thing, which it sort of is. However, it is divided into 6 different lenses, and those are all shown here. And if you recall one of the first diagrams I showed that talked about those recharge areas, there are a number of recharge areas, or sorry, not recharge areas, discharge areas, right? Like the streams, creeks, rivers. And so a number of those are shown here, like the Bass River, Rock Harbor Creek, Blackfish Creek, Pamet River. Those are all areas where, again, like in that diagram, groundwater flows towards, and it kind of expresses itself above the land surface. And what that effectively means is that these 6 groundwater lenses, even though they're sort of lumped into the Cape Cod aquifer, they don't actually share water with one another. And so, activities that may happen in, one lens, the Monomoy lens, for example, really do not have, really can't have much, if any, impact on, say, the Nauset lens, because those 2 lenses don't communicate with one another. And in addition to that, even within the same lens, uh, groundwater doesn't always flow in the same direction, and sort of not all the water kind of talks with one another. So like I talked about before, groundwater is always going to flow kind of, if you think about this as a topographic map, but instead of these showing you the elevation of the land surface, they're showing you the elevation of the water table. So water is always going to flow down the steepest slope. And depending on where you are, that can be, any number of different directions. Like generally, it's always kind of toward the coast, but that could be north if you're on the bay side. It could be south if you're on Nantucket Sound side, et cetera. And so, I think it's really important to keep that in mind, is that when we start to think about, talking about the aquifer and talking about individual lenses and even talking about, specific projects within a single lens, that these are big areas, and we need to be very careful looking at, project specific things and trying to make guesses or estimate impacts without taking into account all of these sorts of details about how groundwater flows, and what the relevant kind of resources that we need to think about are. Uh, Again, just to, kind of hopefully clear up a source of confusion, because there is the sole source aquifer, and this is an EPA designation for the Cape Cod aquifer. And so, there's some detail here about what that means, right? So there's a definition for it from EPA that it supplies at least 50% of the drinking water to a service area. And also, there are no reasonably available alternatives. What this translates to really is it precludes financial assistance for any projects that are determined to have the potential to contaminate the aquifer. And it's sort of really clear, like if you track it down and dig into the language of it, it says, for the purposes of this designation, the Cape Cod aquifer is considered a single continuous aquifer. Sort of reading between the lines, even though it's not a single continuous aquifer, it's 6 lenses that kind of behave, certainly similarly to one another, to the degree that they often experience the same kind of generalized precipitation patterns, but they are kind of hydraulically independent. So one of those things that I always like to try and give a little bit of the background for, because it can get very confusing, sort of giving all of the lenses this one label. All right, so then zooming in a little bit more, and what I imagine folks on this call are especially interested in learning more about, right, is thinking about drinking water, which generally we access through groundwater wells. And so, what are the potential impacts of doing, of installing wells, of having water withdrawals? And And I want to start out by we often use the analogy of straws and, in a cup or in a punch bowl, right? So every single one of those straws, whether it is a municipal supply well, whether it is a private well for a residential home, is doing the same sort of thing. Like this diagram in the upper left could apply to any of those. Obviously, the sort of scale of the arrows and of the different kind of things that we're showing here. So the arrows showing where it's potentially pulling water from, the amount of drawdown of the water table, which is shown by this kind of bend in the water table by the well. Those are going to depend on different things: the size of the well, the rate of the pumping, the characteristics of the aquifer around it, the soil types, and certainly the presence of any resources around the well. So in this diagram, you can see there's kind of, it could be a stream, it could be a lake. It doesn't specify. And we have lots of wells throughout Cape Cod, some of which are very close to surface water resources, others that are further away. And those are all things that, need to be considered when siting wells, and when sort of defining, the operating, permissible operating characteristics for well. That's all stuff that I'm not going to get into too much detail on, but I think our next speaker can speak to it a little bit better. But kind of another element of understanding, the what the what the characteristics of a certain withdrawal are going to be is both to understand potential impacts, but also to make sure that that drinking water supply is protected. So I wanted to give a little background on how that's regulated through MassDEP, through the Bureau of Water Resource Protection, and of course under the Water Management Act. So for public water supplies, there's a requirement of, there's different requirements. There's a zone 1 requirement. That is a 400-foot radius around the well. And that must be either owned or controlled by a public water supplier. So there are very stringent controls on what can happen within 400 feet of that drinking water well. And really activities within that zone 1 are restricted to only activities directly related to the provision of drinking water. Zone 2s then are much larger. They're required for large public water supplies, so over 100,000 gallons per day. They're generally determined by modeling under a certain set of conditions, with kind of this quoted language here. But really, it's, if you look at a couple bullet points down, uh, it's really pretty kind of extreme and conservative. So it's a model based on, 180 days of pumping kind of at their maximum permitted rate, which is, if you're a water supplier, hopefully you don't want to be pumping at 100% for half a year. And it also assumes that there's absolutely no precipitation. So really kind of a worst case scenario to figure out where is the kind of largest area that is going to contribute to a given well. And so that's what's being shown on the left here, and all these kind of light blue gray shaded areas is the zone 2s for all the public water supply wells on Cape Cod. That's over 106 square miles of the Cape is in zone 2s. So while zone 2s are meant to provide protection, and they do restrict some land uses, they restrict things like hazardous material generation or storage, certain land use types, certain wastewater discharge types. They certainly do not restrict development as a blanket, thing. And you can just eyeball this and say, yes, you can probably think of lots of residential development, commercial development, all sorts of development that exists within zone 2s. Again, water supplies on Cape Cod are, pretty diverse, and kind of vary from town to town and region from region. Again, like I mentioned, most of the the drinking water comes from groundwater wells. So there are 160 uh, groundwater supply wells that are in operation for public water supplies. There are also, clearly many more that are sort of smaller scale, non-public water supplies, private wells, et cetera. There's one surface reservoir in Falmouth that also provides drinking water. And the sort of entities that are operating water systems range from, actual municipal divisions to, divisions, departments, different sort of municipally associated organizational structures to, many that are not kind of under the town's purview. So there's separate water districts, there, fire districts that provide drinking water to certain villages or parts of towns. So, the characteristics of how the different water systems operate, as we came to find out, can be very different, but they're all managed or governed under the Water Management Act, and I think Dan is going to get into that a little bit more in his talk, so I'll sort of leave it there. But that's at least the one consistent piece to all of them, is they all have to play under the rules set by the WMA. All right, so one of the big questions, right, is so we have all these wells, we have all these water suppliers, and people want to know, like, how much are we pulling out? How does that compare to the water that's in the aquifer, the water that's entering the aquifer every year? USGS has done some really nice modeling to look at this, to look at, sort of average precipitation, where it goes as it travels through the aquifer, not just in terms of does it go to drinking water systems, but how much goes to the coast, how much goes to streams and rivers, how much goes to freshwater ponds. And so from some of the work they've done, and the numbers are kind of staggering when you look at them. If you average out the rainfall that falls on Cape Cod to, over a year, uh, it translates to about 450 million gallons of water a day. And that, then it scales up to about 165 billion gallons per year. Most of it is just flowing out into the ocean, right? Almost 70%. There's a pretty good amount, almost a quarter of it discharges to streams, and those act kind of like, almost like funnels, delivering water out to the ocean rapidly. And public supplies, make up less than 10%. And again, that's not less than 10% of like the aquifer volume. That's less than 10% of the recharge that happens, in an average year on Cape Cod. That less than 10% is in the range of 11 billion gallons per year from all of the public water supplies. And we've found that, that has remained fairly constant. So that 10.7 number, I think, has shown up in our last 2 or 3 regional policy plans, and those are updated every 5 years. So we haven't seen dramatic, pattern, say increasing patterns, for instance. But I have a little bit more data on that I'll show shortly. Again, since it's an area of interest for this group, USGS also looked at specifically at the lower Cape Cod lenses. So that's the Nauset, Chequesset, Pilgrim, and Pamet. So the four sort of along the forearm and wrist of Cape Cod. And, just for kind of purposes of comparison, like even though the landform is smaller, et cetera, all those things that I said before, it's still like that recharge amount is 68 million gallons a day, or about 2.5 billion gallons per year. Similarly, most of that is flowing to coastal embayments. And again, knowing that two things. One, that this study was conducted before the Eastham public water supply went online. So that, just bear in mind that that's not incorporated into these numbers. But knowing that the public water supply infrastructure is much smaller on the lower and outer Cape, uh, it's still only 7% in the Pamit lens, and so that's where all of the water that is serving sort of Provincetown, the National Park Service properties, et cetera. And for the overall, those four lenses, it's less than 1%. That's again without East Ham's contribution, that's being withdrawn for water supply. Okay, so to switch gears a little bit, but not really. So the Cape Cod Commission received a grant early in 2025 that allowed us to, do a lot more digging into water use data than we had done in a long time. And we had what we thought was a great idea, which was we wanted to look at water use rates, specifically thinking that, we weren't sure what rate structures were like. We didn't know if rate structures could be an effective tool to encourage water conservation, right? Because so far, all I've been talking about is kind of how much we're pumping and thinking about like, how does that compare to our water supply? But there's, of course, a whole nother side to this, which is the water, the demand for that water. And clearly, if people use more water on an individual basis, then the demands, for the same population are going to be much higher on the aquifer. So we did a lot of analysis on water use and also looking at rate structures to see if they were a great, if they could be an effective tool for water conservation. Turns out it was so complicated, and the characteristics of individual water suppliers varied so much that it was really hard to get a sense. And also the science of rate setting and the politics of rate setting also fantastically complicated. So what, what we did not come out with was the conclusion like, yes, we have a great recommendation for rates, for a way that you can set water rates to encourage conservation. There's other reasons why, conservation may not necessarily be in the best interest of water suppliers as well, because that's how they make their money. So that was another wrinkle to it. But as kind of a side observation we made, we looked at the annual pumping, so across all the public water suppliers for close to a 10-year period. And one of the interesting things that we saw is, so 2018, the first year on this graph was a very wet year, like record, instead of getting calls about drought, we were getting calls about flooding basements, very high record high groundwater levels. And in that year, pumping very close to that 10.7 billion gallons. We see some increases and, slight increase in 2019. 2020, which was, a very uncharacteristic year for many reasons, see a pretty large increase in overall pumping. But then 2021 and 2022, both very dry years, and dry years with water restrictions in place, pretty widespread. So that's kind of what this purple stair step indicates. And we see really dramatic decreases in how much water was pumped. So that was one of the things that, wasn't necessarily a target of this study, but something that clearly we heard. Nobody likes water restrictions, not the consumers, the customers, not the suppliers either, because that means, they're not pumping water and they're not making money from ratepayers on that. But it is an effective way to, reduce usage by on the order of billions of gallons a year. So that was one of the things that, we thought was an interesting takeaway when we're thinking about how supply might compare with, current and future demands. What's also interesting about that is when I say water use restrictions, and Dan will say more about how Water Management Act permits relate to use restrictions. That wasn't even all of these suppliers on Cape Cod. So you can see this was from this year when we were in a drought status, and we had everything from the towns and areas in white, which are no restriction, to the yellow, which is voluntary restrictions, to kind of this orange, I guess the more orange, less red orange, is a mandatory restriction of 2 days or more of, hand watering only, no automated sprinkler systems. So that, billions of gallons was based on restrictions in maybe half of the water suppliers, just to give a sense of, how much usage can be curtailed if people are forced to. Something else that was interesting is we got to dig in, and we've given entire presentations on the analysis from this grant and can go into, sort of needless levels of detail. But we also looked at the different places, use types that water was going to. And you can see the sort of what you might expect, the majority of water usage is by residential connections. But one of the things that we thought was really fascinating is there's a type of water use that is reported, and it's called unaccounted for water. And that's basically the difference between the water you pump and then the water that you have sold. And so you've metered at customers' properties, you've measured for, whatever other uses like maintenance activities, et cetera. And it's basically water that, at a minimum isn't being paid for and potentially is just being lost and not even used, potentially through leaks and other issues associated with old infrastructure. And that over this 2011 to 2023 period, ranged between 6 and 10% of that overall pumped volume. And that translates to anywhere from 600 million to 1 billion gallons a year. So that's kind of another just kind of pocket of water that we are already, we're already pumping, and with ways to address it, that could potentially be made available for other purposes, like supporting, additional housing. So this is kind of my summary slide, and I've thrown a lot of things out there, and I think, if there's any sort of takeaway from all of this, it's like, yes, we have like a lot of water, right? And that's really good. It's generally good quality water. That's been kind of a hallmark of Cape Cod's water supplies. But just because none of these things that I've shown are saying like we are pumping the aquifer dry, we're going to run out of water, doesn't mean there aren't challenges to managing water systems and managing water withdrawals. Many of these challenges, and it comes back to what John said from DEP's perspective, there are a lot of things that are demanding funding for water systems. These could be, lead and copper rule improvements, requirements to treat for PFAS and emerging contaminants. There's also just changing weather patterns and usage patterns, and the way that sort of manifests itself as demands on the water supplies and their equipment. Again, it's also not just like what you pump throughout the year, but it also matters when and how much you're pumping. As everyone might expect, about 50% of the water is pumped during the third quarter, so June to September. In a given year, that's what our analysis showed. And so that creates kind of a special level of demand that needs to be met for maybe 5 or 6 weeks a year. And then a lot of capacity that sits unused, which is an extra challenge for maintenance of these systems, keeping things operating. And so much of that, then can create challenges with, aging equipment, needing redundancy for maintenance for aging equipment or for installing new treatment, et cetera. And all of that is just super important because siting new wells is expensive and it's challenging and it's time consuming. So that's not the kind of thing that you can do, say, in response to an emergency. So kind of all these other levers that we can turn to make better use of the water that we're already sort of able to and permitted to pump. Those are all things that are kind of going to lead to a more resilient system so that we can, use the water to do what we want rather than kind of be stuck with doing just what we're able to. So I'm going to leave it there and then turn it back to Amanda.
Tim, thank you so much. This is going to be, I feel like we're all going to get off of this and just like sit quietly for 10 minutes and just think about everything that we've heard. But this is a tremendous amount of information and really, really helpful. I am not a water person and I'm really enjoying learning about it. And it is extremely helpful to start literally at the water cycle and then move through all of the other layers to understand all of the nuance that goes into this. So to give us another perspective, no pun intended, lens, I am going to turn it over to Dan Pelletier, who is a current principal at Waterworks Consulting and a former Harwich Water Superintendent. And he's going to talk to us about what it takes to operate and regulate and maintain a water system. So Dan, over to you. Excuse me.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. Let me just pop the slideshow up on the screen here. Is that coming through?
That looks great.
All right, yeah, thank you. So as Amanda had noted, I had the opportunity to run the Harwich Water System for just under 10 years. And during that time, we were actually renewing our Water Management Act permit. Permits were set to expire originally in 2010, and there was a lot of litigation and extensions to those permits. And I believe the permit was issued just before I left in April of 2024. So it was about quite some time between when they were supposed to be renewed and renewed. So what is a Water Management Act permit? So the Water Management Act was promulgated in, I believe it was 1986, and water systems had to apply for a Water Management Act permit or register their existing wells by 1988. Registered wells are, I would argue, less regulated than a permitted well. The registration process, like I said, happened back in I believe it was the 80s, and water suppliers would submit a document to the state that says this is what my well is approved for, and then they were grandfathered that volume year after year. It was in 2010 when DEP sought to impose the ability to restrict pumping on registered wells that caused all that litigation, resulting in the extension of the 2010 permits. So who needs a Water Management Act permit? We talked a lot already about public water suppliers needing them, but it's really any person who is intending to withdraw an annual average of 100,000 gallons per day from the ground, or 9 million gallons in any 3-month period. So this can include golf courses, daycare facilities, summer camps, cranberry growers, ski areas. Now, there's a lot of those on the Cape, and other different industries. So one thing to note, and what happens oftentimes when water restrictions are implemented, is as the water supplier, we get inundated with resident calls complaining about neighbors or people using water. How is the golf course being watered? So businesses or entities where their core function is use of that water for a golf course, a nursery, things of that instance, they're actually allowed to continue using water during periods of water restrictions. So beyond that, what does a Water Management Act permit actually do? For the water supplier, it's going to dictate what our average daily withdrawal rate is. It's going to dictate what our individual source max daily withdrawals, so how much any one well can pump on any one given day. And it also defines the conditions for which water suppliers are required to implement water restrictions. So as I just mentioned, DEP will regulate our maximum daily withdrawals. And on the slide here, sorry, I'm just going to move my thing out of the way. You can see in the gray bars on the chart are our DEP approved max daily limits, and the blue bars represent the actual physical limitations of the wells. And that could be because a pump was changed out, a smaller motor was put in, or it could be that over time, iron and manganese has built up in the aggregate in the soil around the well and has actually reduced the pumping rate. So we can't pump as much as we could when the well was originally installed. There are things that water suppliers can do. We can clean and redevelop wells and try and restore that capacity. But it is a battle that we continuously fight with the raw groundwater having a lot of high iron and manganese. And beyond the individual wells, when we're talking about being regulated on our annual average, for the 1990 to 2020 permit for the town of Harwich, they were allotted 2.16 million gallons per day on average, which works out to about 788 million gallons per year. We did exceed that capacity in 2015 and 2016. There ultimately were no repercussions for exceeding the permit. We were in DEP's good graces. One of the reasons I believe is that we had low unaccounted for water, something that Tim was just mentioning. So if a water system exceeds their permit and they have unaccounted for water in the 12, 15%, DEP is going to come down. I believe they can levy fines, enforcement orders, and things of that nature. In the case of Harwich, I believe that year we were between the 3 and 5% unaccounted for water. So the aquifer was in good condition. Our unaccounted for water was low. The threshold that you're trying to get under with regard to your permit is 10%. You start to get into trouble with DEP when your unaccounted for water exceeds 10%. So it was those exceedances, as well as water needs forecasts, which we'll talk about in a little bit, that ultimately warranted an increase in Harwich's permitted capacity for the permit that they currently have through 2032. That permit increase went up to 2.39 million gallons per day for an annual total of 872 million gallons. As I just mentioned, the water needs forecast. So one of the things that often comes up with discussions surrounding housing and water use is, these big housing projects are going to pump the well dry. We're not going to have enough water for the town. One of the things that we did in the Water Management Act permit application process is go through a water needs forecast. And we looked at historical water usage, we looked at population trends, actual pumping data to justify and warrant that increase in pumping capacity. Another question that's commonly asked is, what is average household water use? It's a really difficult question to answer because it can vary quite dramatically from house to house. Your low user, your conservative user, someone who doesn't have irrigation, just your domestic use could be 5 to 10,000 gallons per year. Maybe someone with kids, but still not an irrigation system, a lot of showers, you might be in that 25 to 50. And, we do see a lot of houses and residential properties exceed 100,000 gallons per year. I know from having visited a number of those houses that some of them just have 2 people living in them and a beautifully landscaped lawn. So a lot of the water capacity does go towards irrigation and that sort of usage. And one thing I would often say to people concerned about pumping the well dry and not having water for new housing developments or things of that nature is there's plenty of water. It's ultimately just how we use it. If we ultimately stopped using water for irrigation, I would say you could build out the entirety of Cape Cod and not be concerned about having enough water to drink. Now, from water system capacity, how much water can we pump? What is it like to pump in the winter versus the summer? As Tim mentioned, it's a dramatic difference. We see a huge population influx. The year-round population in Harwich was estimated around 13,000, and it was estimated to balloon up to 40 to 50,000 in the peak summer months. On an average winter day, we would pump around 800,000 gallons per day, and that would balloon up to an average of 4 to 5 million per day during the summer. So pump run times, this chart on the slide here, I graphed basically how much water we could pump with the wells on for say 8 hours, 12 hours, 16 hours. We could pump about 6,000 gallons a minute with all 14 wells running. And you can see in 2010, our peak day, this red dotted line was just over, was about 7 million gallons. In that instance, our pumps were running, about 20 hours that day. So we're really up against the threshold on those peak days. I would also say with regard to fire flow, I did have the opportunity to respond to one major structure fire while I was in Harwich. I was able to pull up the water system SCADA system on my phone and watch the water drain from the tanks. And fortunately, with our 6,000 gallon per minute capacity, there was ultimately no impact on our ability to sustain water and keep those tanks full. Beyond our average and max daily pumping limits, our Water Management Act permit also defines the conditions for which we have to implement water restrictions. So the text on this slide was a direct screen capture from the language within Harwich's new Water Management Act permit. And what it states is that there are two conditions that need to be apparent in order for restrictions to go in place. The groundwater needs to go below defined trigger values, which are underlined in the table here, and I plotted them on the graph to the right. And what those red trigger lines, and then you see the blue trend line beneath it, that's the actual water level of the monitoring well that Harwich is looking at for determining water restrictions. And in the case of today, we are well below those groundwater triggers. Now that, in combination with a level 1 mild drought declaration from the state of Massachusetts, requires Harwich to then implement water restrictions. My understanding is that they are currently in restrictions and have been for some time. I know that there's been quite a drought the last couple of years and has not been a lot of recharge. So I would urge everybody in the class today to refrain from using water this spring as we come out of the winter months. And again, Tim had one of these up just a minute ago, but this is showing current drought. And as I just said, the entire Cape Cod region is still in a level 2 significant drought. With water restrictions, as I mentioned earlier, where your core functions of a business require water, you are allowed to continue using it. That also does include livestock, farms, and things of that nature, or any order from the Board of Health, if there's a reason that they may require. Conservation Commission, there have been instances where we were required to allow people to water plantings that were used for restoring bankings and things along coastal waterways. So it's not a blanket restriction that's applicable to everyone, but it is pretty broad. So Tim also mentioned water systems get their money from pumping water, and that is, there's no truer statement. From fiscal year 19, I apologize, some of the dates are from a few years back, but Harwich's revenue for fiscal year 19 was 3.6 million derived strictly from the sale of water. There was an additional about $700,000 beyond that the department would collect from user fees, backflow inspections, and things of that nature. But we were funded solely from the sale of water. And when we implement water restrictions, that has a major impact. It is during the quarter for which we are collecting most of our revenue. If you look at it on a quarter by quarter basis in the middle upper part of the slide there, we collected 1.9 million in revenue in that one summer quarter and about $500,000 or more in the remaining 3 quarters. Harwich was an enterprise account or an enterprise fund. Water systems can have several different ways in which they operate. There's some funded by the general fund, some funded through special revenue accounts and enterprise funds. So in the case of Harwich with an enterprise fund, we took no money from the general fund or any tax levy. We generated all the money that we spent to continue to operate, as well as for capital improvement projects. And the infrastructure was put in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and we're really approaching, nationwide, I would argue, the end of our useful life for a lot of America's infrastructure. And every water system is required to have a 30-year master plan that outlines distribution system improvements, treatment system improvements, water storage tank improvements, things of that nature to maintain the $1 billion+ of infrastructure that's in the ground. This is a map of the town of Harwich that just kind of highlights the 30-year capital improvement plan. You can see there's things pointing to everywhere. So needless to say, this is an older plan. This actually predates PFAS legislation. Fortunately, Harwich has not detected any PFAS, so there's no plans right now to build any treatment plants there. But it is definitely something that's always in the back of your mind because it can come at any point. And with all this infrastructure for water, we're seeing it again, millions and millions and millions being spent all over the Commonwealth, all over the country to try and restore and to preserve our drinking water. And I would throw out, I think it was last year's topic on wastewater, but there is a delicate balance here between water systems and wastewater systems. Both of them do require some of the same precious resources, which is undeveloped land that is often very hard to come by on Cape Cod, as well as Tim pointed out and showed on the map, all of the Zone 2 land. You are able to construct effluent recharge sites within a Zone 2. However, I think we would all choose to do it outside of there if possible. On the map here, you see 2 proposed effluent recharge sites in the town of Harwich in red, and those blue swaths are the Zone 2s for Harwich's drinking water wells. So it's a delicate balance, competing for funds and natural resources. That's all I got.
Dan, thank you so much. It is so interesting that it's almost, I don't want to say ironic, but it's really interesting tension that, you have water systems and the way that they generate revenue is through using the water. So while we're trying to be, strategic and thoughtful about how we're using one of our most precious resources, the way that we continue to get that water is through a water system that needs to pump to be able to continue to function. So that's my quick and dirty takeaway for that. I am going to pin Tim as well. Oh, I'm not going to mute myself. I think that would be bad, for me at least. This is so much information to digest. Thank you both so much again for being here. I have a couple of questions from the chat that we'll get through, and then we'll send everyone on with their afternoon. So a couple at the top are just sort of factual pieces. So Tim, you covered that ponds are discharge areas, but what are marshes? Are they also discharge areas?
I would say for both ponds and marshes, most likely, yes. So most of those surface water features are connected to groundwater, but there are some exceptions to that.
Great. Thank you for that. And for Dan, can you talk about why iron and manganese build up around wells?
Yeah, I mean, so ultimately, iron and manganese are in solution in the groundwater. They're naturally occurring minerals. If you've ever seen a big hole dug on Cape Cod, sometimes you can see the veins of real dark iron. And as we pump that water and we draw that iron-laden water through the aggregates and the sand in the beneath the ground, it ultimately does build up. And you have to surge it and flush it. They use chlorine, I believe, and muriatic acid to clean and surge and evacuate the iron and manganese and restore the capacity.
All right, thank you. So Tim, you touched on the study of the water systems and talked about sort of this interplay between tiered water rates and watering restrictions and how they impact water usage. Are there other strategies that towns can consider in terms of lowering water usage, or are there other things that have been tried and what's been the impact? Like, what do you think is good bang for the buck, if there is such a thing in terms of, and Dan, you get to answer this one too. Like,
I don't want to steal Tim's thunder, but what I would
go
say
ahead, Dan.
at the onset is rain gauges, rain gauges, rain gauges, rain gauges. And if you can level up even further than that and get one that monitors the moisture of the soil, so it's not just rain, but if the soil is moist enough for the grass, it won't run the sprinkler. Um, in the summer mornings, the water storage tanks, I mean, it's almost in free fall, with all pumps running at 6,000 gallons a minute. We're not gaining on those tanks until 1, 2 in the afternoon, to start filling them back up. So trying to irrigate smartly would be good.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think one of the big takeaways that we came out of that study with was it's really like as boring as it seems, it's really an education question. And it could be, on things like Dan just mentioned about like appropriate watering and effective watering if assuming that we're not just going to have irrigation go away completely cold turkey, being more thoughtful about it, but also things like even with your own plumbing in your house, like understanding that leaks can be huge consumers of water. And maybe you don't notice it because water rates are relatively low, or maybe you don't notice it because you don't get your bill until, 6 months from when the leak starts. So there are lots of, smaller steps that might be challenging for various reasons, but making, whether it is through education or whether it's through more frequent billing or smart meters or things like that that can sort of connect what people's behavior, like what I'm doing with my hose, with my tap, with my irrigation system, and connecting that to the fact that it has to come from somewhere, that Dan or someone else is having to run a pump to provide that. And even if it only costs me a couple bucks to have a toilet that's running all the time, like those things can be, especially when multiplied out over an entire water system, like, they can be big water consumers. And I mean, it's great as a source of revenue, but I think we'd prefer to be using that for, other purposes that are maybe higher on a priority list. So, there's been some materials produced at the state level. Certainly the state has been very engaged because there has been so much just of an ongoing drought condition statewide. And so they've created some really good outreach materials. But yeah, I think that was where we landed, is it just, finding ways to make a better connection between like the people's activities that are impacting water use, and how that may play out through operation of a water system, your water bill, etc.
Awesome. Thank you for that. So I guess building on that is, our audience today is mostly municipal board and committee members. What would you like them to take away from this session? Obviously, you've just given us a lot to think about, but what would you like for them to take away from? Dan, do you want to start? And then Tim, I'll come to you.
Yeah, I guess big ticket is, if you're approached with a big development project or something of that nature, understand that it's probably something your water system has taken into account. Um, and also support your local water system. If some of the things here we talked about interest you, reach out to your local water system. I can speak about Harwich and their capacities and capabilities, but it really is unique, from town by town, water system by water system, the investments they've made over the decades, over the, in treatment and things of that nature. So some systems need more than others. So yeah, I guess I'll leave it with that.
Thank you, Dan. Tim, what do you think?
I would echo the same thing, which is just to say, like, really, especially if you are on a, if your water system operates in a way where, as a select board member, like, you may actually have some or complete control over rate setting, really just to engage with your superintendent, with your water system staff, to understand, because of course nobody wants to pay more. Nobody wants to see their rates go up. But I think understanding why there are proposals, because a lot of, one of the really fascinating things that we found out from talking to lots of water system staff was that there are some water systems that don't even cover their operating expenses through rates and have to dip into general funds, have to dip into other pools of money. There are some where rates cover operating expenses, but then when it comes to, forecasted capital improvements or, upkeep of potentially aging infrastructure. So I think really getting an understanding of how that structure works, where the money for these different needs for the water system is coming from, and if you're comfortable with that structure, making sure that none of those sources dry up, and if you think there's a better way to do it, exploring those sorts of things. But really just being getting some more of that information about what exactly rates are covering and aren't covering. And that way, if you do need to increase rates, you have a really good way of explaining, what people are getting for it, other than just a higher bill for,
Right.
what they want to use water for.
Thank you for that. Okay. From the chat, what happens to the environment, ponds, streams, marshes when we overpump our lens?
Yeah, I mean, I generally, right? So it's like that one diagram I showed where every well, when you pump it, it's going to sort of pull the level of groundwater down around it. And so when you have a wetland or a pond that is fed by groundwater, it can, similarly, it can pull that water level down. Again, it depends on the proximity of those water resources. It depends on the size and pumping rate of the well. And also, these are all things, and I'm sure Dan can speak about this to more detail. Like, that's part of when you're trying to site a new well and apply for a Water Management Act permit. Those are all things that are modeled, considered, often required to be monitored even after a well is installed. So it's, there are potential impacts, but they're not in any way ignored through the siting of wells and the operation of them.
And I guess to piggyback on there, in my experience, at least in Harwich, we never had a situation where a well ran dry, or close for that matter. At a prior water system that I worked at many moons ago, we did have one well that was susceptible in the summer to getting extremely low, and if we ran that well at 100%, it would end up sucking air. In the case of that well, we were able to operate it based off of water levels. So it would modulate the speed of the pump and motor as to not drop the water level in the well below a certain threshold. So if there was a well that you had issues pumping dry, that would be a way that you could safely continue to pump water out of it. But as Tim said, and as we discussed, a lot of this, the safe yield for a well and capacity, daily capacity, max daily average is all thought out in the Water Management Act permits and in a water systems, capacity evaluation, which DEP also looks at your capacity and ability to supply the water that's needed. So unless people are not doing their jobs or trying to, harm the system, I wouldn't foresee a situation where it would be pumped dry.
Thank you for that. Can we return to Tim, you had talked about this unused or sort of unaccounted for water. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Or just like, the idea of where, how we're identifying it, like what it sort of means.
Yeah, I mean, well, part of it is in the name, which is we don't necessarily know. And there's different types of unaccounted for water. Some of it is sort of like estimated, like when hydrant flushing occurs, right? Like often that is, an estimated use. And those are all sort of considered in those totals. So really unaccounted for water is just,
It
it's
could
a
be a
difference.
pinhole leak. It could be
Yeah, like
a
it's a
overflow
difference
in the water
between what's
main.
pumped and
Yeah.
what's sold. And it could be, meters as they age, I believe, tend to read lower than what's actually flowing through them. So that could be part of it. But certainly, leaks for sure. It's going out of your water main and into the ground.
And it's a lot.
And
The
it's
number that you came up with for the whole Cape it's a
Yeah,
lot of
yeah,
water.
and of course, like so many of these things, like actual losses, you would tend to associate with older infrastructure. So if you have a relatively new water system, you would hope unaccounted for water will be relatively low, and it would be again, due to sort of equipment issues like meters rather than just leaks and actual lost water.
Thank you. All right. If 70% of the water is running into the ocean, why are things like irrigation, leaking toilets, etc., a problem? It seems like we've got plenty of water. So what is it that we're concerned about and we're trying to solve for?
The water beneath our feet and our ability to get it out are two completely separate things. I would start with that. And beyond our physical ability to get it out, we have the regulatory pressures that limit our, pumping and capacity and things of that nature. I understand and certainly understand the question. If we don't use it, we lose it, right? And I would face that a lot when we implement water restrictions or people with wells. But I guess I don't know if Tim, you want to jump in, but our ability to get the water is definitely a major part of that.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it comes down to also like when and how much, right? So that 70% is sort of aggregated across the year. But if if we're talking like the Cape wide, we saw like 50% of water is pumped from June through September. Dan saw, even upwards of like 60% in that quarter in Harwich. And so if you were doing all that pumping all at the same time at sort of maximum pump capacities and everything, you are exacerbating, and also like potentially at the time when environmental conditions are most extreme from the aquifer standpoint. So you generally have less rainfall in the summer, you have high levels of plant growth, and so they're all pulling water out of the soil through plant roots and then evapotranspirating it through their leaves. So it's really, you have all these different demands on that groundwater supply magnified over 3 months. And doing all of those things at the same time is where you can potentially start to see negative impacts on things like surface waters, ponds, wetlands, etc. But on pumping equipment too, that if you're constantly running the water level in a well lower, you're getting less help from gravity. So your pumps are having to work harder, so they're going to wear out faster. So like it's the confluence of all those things can potentially lead to negative environmental effects, but also it leads to higher operating costs and more frequent equipment failures for the water systems as well. So that's how you can both have like such a small fraction of water being withdrawn for drinking water supplies, and we're not running down the Ogallala aquifer, but you can still have problems withdrawing how much you want to for all of those things on July 5th or certain times a year. And then all of those factors, right, can sort of put a water system on the edge to where a fire response or a pump going down or a PFAS detection in a well, any sort of thing like that. And then all of a sudden you go from like, we're okay, but just barely, to now we have a major problem. And so doing anything we can to kind of reduce all of those demands and create a little headroom is just going to kind of make for more room for wiggle room at those times of extreme demand.
Thank you for that. And you inadvertently answered my next question, which was that I think a lot of the time we think of or see like water supply and capacity being presented as being like this fixed capacity or this fixed thing. And so I was going to ask you to talk about some of the factors that influence water supply and capacity. And so I think that was a perfect explanation that it's timing. It could be, environmental factors, fire response, that, we talk about the numbers in the aggregate, but what the actual day-to-day or confluence of factors can certainly add up. Okay, going back to metering, a question from the chat is, are there towns that have close to real-time metering or smart metering, to either of your knowledge?
Yes. I know there's a couple. I don't know if I think it's Orleans has the instant metering, where they have a cell network and they can pretty much read the meter at the push of a button across town. Harwich was a drive-by, so we had to put someone out in a meter reading vehicle and drive past every house. But
Yeah, I believe Yarmouth as well is at least starting to roll out the smart meters.
All right. Is that really prevalent in other places in Massachusetts or in other places in the country, or is this sort of at like the forefront of, where water systems management is headed next?
I mean, I would say it's definitely the future of water meters. It is a massive investment for the water system to swap, in the case of Harwich, over 10,000 meters at several $100 each. And then there's a whole infrastructure that you need to set up with a cell network in order to be able to read those meters. So it's a pretty considerable investment. The meters we do have, they do capture history. We can go and data log them and get a 60, 90-day history to see, what transpired over the previous quarter. But it's not the instantaneous ones.
Great. Okay. Very good. Is there anything that either of you would like to reiterate or just call to our attention once more as we close up the session?
So I think we've covered all of my points to reiterate already in Q&A.
Great. Excellent.
Likewise.
All right. Well, then you guys both get a gold star as presenters. I think I got most of the questions in the chat. If anybody, I missed you, I will send out the follow-up email with the recording, the slide decks themselves, and contact information for our presenters. So if there are things that you'd love to get into the weeds about, please reach out to our presenters directly. I'm sure they'd love to talk to you about it. All right. Before I let you all go, I will also include an evaluation of this session in the follow-up. And that also includes ideas for future sessions. Obviously, this is really topical and a really critical topic. So I would imagine that we will continue to have these sort of explorations as we move through future sessions and future years of the Lower Cape Housing Institute. So if you've got other things that you'd like for us to talk about, please let me know. And then next month, February, our workshop is going to be about form-based code. March is peer group. April, we're going to talk about exit planning for small businesses and what it means for our communities. And for that, I'll give you all back 4 minutes of your time. And thank you all so much again for coming out. I really appreciate your time and engaging with what is a really important conversation as we figure out how we can, maintain really high water quality, be protective of our resources, and also work towards our housing goals. So thank you all so much. I'm going to push stop before I forget to stop recording. Yes.